Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Thank you all so much for joining us at the 78th Annual Conference on World Affairs here at CU Boulder. My name is Kaylee Bishop. I am a graduate student and researcher in the Collaborative AI and Robotics Lab here at CU, and I will be serving as your moderator today. Before I go on, can I just get a thumbs up from the back if you can hear me okay? Excellent, all right. So for the purposes of the recording, today is Wednesday, April 15th, 2026. The time is 11:15 a.m. Mountain Time. And the title of this panel is AI Wild West, Who is in Charge? Now, before we get started, I would like to read the University of Colorado Boulder's land acknowledgement. The University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of Indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on Indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with Indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of Indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty in their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating Indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. Thank you. Once again, welcome to CWA and today's discussion. We ask that all our attendees remain respectful throughout the discussion and refrain from interruptions. Signs, banners, noisemakers, and other audible disruptions are not permitted and will result in those responsible being asked to leave the room. Please silence your phones at this time. Time will be allotted for questions from our in-person audience. We will take your questions via handwritten note cards. Please raise your hand if you have a question, and a producer will give you a note card and a pencil. Please print legibly, then raise your hand when you have a completed card, and a producer will collect it and bring it to me. And now I would like to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves, and I remind our audience that full speaker bios can be found online at the CWA website. So we'll start here with Sheila Warren.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Oh. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And can everyone hear me in the back as well? Fantastic. Okay. I'm Sheila Warren. I'm currently the chair of the Advanced AI Society, which is working on a framework we're calling Proof of Control, which basically is trying to establish that there are many different ways to articulate when and how humans are engaged in AI systems. We're agnostic about all those different ways, but we think it's important to have attestation that is standardized so that you can tell when and how humans are engaging in these AI systems as things get more and more complicated. By background, I'm a lawyer by training. I've done stints in corporate law. I spent a decade in civic tech, building digital public infrastructure and other kinds of civic architecture and infrastructure. I founded the blockchain team at the World Economic Forum. And when I left the forum, I ran what was called the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which oversaw technology and policy-related matters in 18 countries all around the world. My focuses areas were specifically blockchain technologies, AI, and data. But I also oversaw drones and biotech and all kinds of other areas that I do not make any claim to be an expert in whatsoever. From there, I worked in crypto policy with a consumer focus for some years. I was the founding CEO of a policy organization in that space, based in Washington, London, Brussels, Hong Kong. And then most recently, I was working at a philanthropic institution that was working on decentralized social media and decentralized AI. And now I'm the chair of the Advanced AI Society. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. My name is Sofia Romansky, and I'm an analyst at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, which is a think tank based in the Netherlands. It is a geopolitical think tank, so those are also the issues that we primarily focus on. And as a researcher, my work primarily concerns the impact of artificial intelligence on social and military domains. With this, for the last 2 years, I was the project coordinator and the pen holder for the Global Commission on Responsible AI in the Military Domain, which was an international initiative that was launched by the government of the Netherlands in cooperation with several other states to come to somewhat of a shared understanding about what responsible AI means in the military context. So that's also for all of my interventions in this panel and also in my panels later today. That's the angle that I will be coming from. Aside from this, my work really is incredibly interdisciplinary, and that's also what I try to bring to the spaces, trying to translate between all of the different disciplines that make AI what it is, but also all of the different areas where AI is applicable. And finally, I suppose worth mentioning as a researcher, also one of my pet projects is on something that it can be referred to as epistemic responsibility in the age of AI. How do we deal with knowledge, the creation of knowledge and understanding when we have tools that are able to pre-digest information for us in personalized ways? And so while right now we are all at a level of expertise where AI and specifically generative AI can be a very useful tool, looking forward towards future generations that might not be able to reach our level of expertise, how do we ensure that they're still able to do that without being excessively reliant on tools? So that's just a short pitch about myself. Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Asha Jay, and I'm a National Geographic explorer. I primarily started off working on leveraging mass media conduits around the world to break urgent stories of our time, particularly pertaining to wildlife trafficking. But that led into working on microeconomic initiatives, bringing more collaborations about that would allow for us to foster ground-up change where people were actually able to participate and empower themselves through remunerative opportunities that were localized and not constantly requiring, external funding or charity. And then that led me to working more in corporate governance and policy, because without corporate accountability and stewardship, you can't really pull off a lot of the commitments that they aspire to, but often have a change of heart because of change of direction, a loss of a department, downsizing, whatever their reasons are, which resulted in wanting greater corporate accountability, which led me down to the space of shareholder advocacy, as it does. And so now I work a lot with proxy voting, enabling civil society organizations to create voting recommendations that would allow us to empower shareholders to vote in alignment with their values. It doesn't matter if you're politically right or left, you still have values that inform your daily decisions, and you're already donating to nonprofits you care about, so just vote in alignment with those nonprofits on your shares. So it's just streamlining sort of what your left hand and right hand is doing, right? Like that we can work in greater cohesion and congruence. And that common sense and logic has also threaded through a lot of technology initiatives that I've been involved in, including working on a blockchain initiative to bring about such corporate accountability, which kind of blew up in my face, not surprisingly, because they don't want that level of optics or clarity into their philanthropic donations. So that led me to working in the shareholder advocacy space, which does entail needing to leverage AI. But I also, in my own time, have been super passionate about how I utilize AI to enable messaging, outreach, fostering greater connection and community. And it can be done responsibly, especially because I work in the scientific space. Information credibility, especially in today's world where misinformation and disinformation is at scale, it has been of tremendous importance. And so how can we disperse what is known, what is accurate, in meaningful ways that still empower engagement, participation, and the democratic impulse that drives this nation and should drive sort of the global urge to be representative in how anything comes about, because it does represent all of us, whether we want to account for it, whether the systems are accounting for it or not, it should, because we're all here in it together. So I think I just operate from the space of common sense and logic, and if more of us did that, I think the world would be a better place.
Hi, good morning. I'm Ling Xing. I am a journalist working for an international newspaper. The paper is called the South China Morning Post. It's actually a really old paper. It has been around for more than 100 years. It's headquartered in Hong Kong with bureaus across the world. I work on the science desk, so I'm a science journalist and I mainly cover physics, astronomy, and space. So I am obsessed with stuff like telescopes, particle colliders, as well as rockets. And I know I need to be honest, I know very little about artificial intelligence because AI is covered by our tech desk. So today I am mainly here to learn from the other panelists and the audience.
All right, thank you all so much. So the title of this panel is Who is in Charge, which is a loaded question, and I'm sure we'll spend the whole hour kind of unpacking it, and also the sort of implicit follow-on, which is what should we do about it, right? So maybe just to get things rolling, maybe we could, if you could each speak a little bit about, like, how do you see the current situation, who is effectively in charge, and what do you think is, like, the biggest obstacle between where we are now and passing, like, meaningful regulation? So we can start however, we can go in whatever order.
So I think one of the most dangerous myths that we tend to be sold on of late is that AI is somehow autonomous, and that is essentially the most insidious way to pass the buck. It's a way to shirk responsibility. Institutions, founders, venture capitalists, individuals are all behind any of the algorithms that are constructed and deployed. They're deployed at scale. Brute force is prioritized. Computational power is prioritized. Not efficacy, not relational integrity, not context, not kindness or care. So the humanity has been stripped out of it because all we're looking at is scale. And we've come to attribute intelligence to computational power. So that means that it becomes painted as an entity that has just come about, and no one can hold it accountable. There's no face behind it. So there's no individual that can be pointed at. And then paint onto that the fact that what can only be framed as technocratic authoritarianism, which is these billionaires who have come upon these technologies and deployed it without any compunction to the masses, who create, a feature and then just put it out there. And we are the guinea pigs who have to face the consequences of what that does in real world. So they're testing the scenarios at scale, and then once the consequences emerge, they deflect responsibility for it, because taking ownership would mean having to shift how things are done. And then also the way it hides is under this notion of a black box, because it doesn't have to reveal how it thinks the way it thinks, why it's processing information the way it is. And we have technical language around all of this, which makes us, on average, the general person is left out of the discourse. So you may just feel like an idiot because you don't know what an LLM is or what another acronym that sounds sexy. But all of it is just a way to be exclusionary, to not be representative. And then, of course, there's like statistics, which I'm sure we'll get into, but like it's a very narrow segment of the population that is putting out these large language models, so the information being fed into it is definitely skewed. It is not representative of everybody in the world. It is not representative even on just the basis of gender, let alone ethnicities or anything, right? So it's like, it is obviously not an equitable field. And given that it's allowed to be at the speed and scale that it is, without any reins or guardrails put on it, it can go on to represent certain ideologies, certain agendas, consolidating power and profit in the hands of the few at the cost of the many. This is not like a new problem. Like, this is not even a new pattern of our mind playing out the way it is. It is literally the same problem with a new face, and we shouldn't be so confused by it. Like, this is the most human condition, finding yet another conduit through which it's finding expression. So I think it's very easy to say, oh, it's AI, and like, oh, it's sentient, we should be afraid of it. And all. There's just so much fear-mongering, but there's fear-mongering around everything in today's world, and this is just yet another face of the same hydra.
I would like to very much second a lot of the things that you said. For me, the primary issue is responsibility. I can give you a very simple answer about who's in charge. We are in charge. Humans are in charge. But because of the way that generative AI specifically works, it creates temptations and incentives to offload elements of our humanity onto the system, meaning that we export our critical thinking, our processing, the kind of difficult things that we need to do in order to understand reality and the world around us, but we are very much tempted to let this machine that we see as very efficient and very effective at doing it, because it speaks the same way as we do, it presents things in a clear way probably, and we think, well, it does it way better than we could ever do it, so it's probably better. But because of that, we are facing I would call it a crisis of displaced responsibility, where we are losing a sense of what our purpose is, in a way, almost. For me, like, all of these problems are fundamentally philosophical. Like, they are technical, of course, as well, but we need to reflect on what does it mean for people to think and to participate and to create all of these things. And to make it a little bit more concrete, I'll zoom in into the military domain, so what I work on. And there's two primary kind of patterns of displaced responsibility. The first one is in the chain of command. And specifically, I want to say, artificial intelligence as an entire category of technologies is, one, not new, and also not new to the military domain. Artificial intelligence and certain steps of automation, including in targeting cycles, have been around for decades already. What is new is the use of specifically generative AI, large language models, as part of decision-making support. So the ability to process vast amount of data and then have an interface that communicates to you with human language, what is called natural language, to kind of explain that term very quickly. And when you have, let's say, a system operator, a soldier, that is interacting with this program, because it is so human in so many ways, there is a temptation to trust it and over-trust it. And this is something that we call automation bias, where what I mentioned, that because we think it's processed so much data, it must know more, and so it must be leading or suggesting better decisions. But this is very problematic when you bring this to the context of international law. When you're going to be trying to establish whether, for example, a war crime has occurred, you need to know what happened in the chain of command that led to a mistake. But if you have individuals in that chain that, one, do not know how a decision was made, and also don't feel responsibility, even moral responsibility for something that went wrong, then the systems that we have in place don't work, because they're designed for human accountability. Exactly as you said, AI systems cannot be held accountable, and also, I would say, should not be held accountable. But the second point where responsibility is displaced is in the dynamic that we are now seeing between the private sector and military organizations. The way that military organizations now become more the takers of technology rather than on the demand side. So asking for specific tools that can help solve specific problems and lead to specific outcomes, right? It's efficiency for the sake of efficiency. And unfortunately, as war is a human invention, it is boggling that we want to just become better at killing. Like, nobody is really asking the question of, well, how can AI help us prevent war? How can it help us de-escalate? Because the private sector, and especially, again, I'm always very deliberate about this, when it comes to generative AI, the private companies that are making this are selling it as a solution for everything. But it really isn't, and kind of because it's become such a core part of geopolitical competition, militaries are trying to put it into every hole that exists and maybe even coming up with holes that didn't exist where AI could still be put, instead of being the ones to ask for specific technical solutions where AI could be very helpful and very efficient. And that leads to a lot of confusion and problems both on the organizational side but also in our general conversation. So these 2 points were what I see as kind of the essences of how responsibility is displaced are most concerning to me when it comes to the military domain, but they obviously have ripple effects in other domains. And honestly, because AI is a dual-use technology, you really can't separate them in the first place either. Thank you.
I agree with everything that's been said so far. I think that the scapegoating of AI systems as allowing humans who are in that loop to shirk responsibility is highly problematic. But I would also argue that the dehumanization that we point to AI as being a causal factor in, which I think is fair, is an upstream problem. It is reflecting a persistent dehumanization in society that we're seeing across a variety of sectors, certainly in our political rhetoric, and that is not just an American problem, it's a global problem, in the ways we're thinking about war versus peace and what we're naming our departments, for example. In all these ways, how we're thinking about immigration, how we're thinking about borders, how we're thinking about climate, how we're thinking who's getting insured. In all these ways, there's a persistent dehumanization that's happening, and that is both an online and offline problem. And if we don't talk about that as a societal problem, and we talk about it as a technical problem, I think we are missing the forest for the trees. So that's kind of one thing I want to say. And then the second thing is, in terms of who's in charge or who's responsible, it's the exercise we've been doing for 100 years, which is follow the money. And so I often say it's like a different day, it's a slightly different villain, okay? So I live near now, but I've lived in Silicon Valley for over 20 years, and it's the same story. The difference is it's a lot faster this time. So I spent time, as I said in my intro, in the crypto space, and when Sam Altman made his first trip, Sam Altman, OpenAI, made his first trip to Washington, D.C., I was like, we just had a guy named Sam Bankman who committed one of the biggest frauds, and now we have, is this a joke? Like, are you kidding me? You know, which was a joke because it wasn't meant to cast disparagement, but it's kind of like, wow, this is kind of where we are, okay? They lived in the same place, they grew up in similar ways, they have the same networks, I mean, they're funded by the same people, like, what are we doing here? So I think that it's a follow the money kind of question. What do the venture capitalists and the others, not to again point, everybody who's put money into these systems want out of them? Well, it's not a better humanity, let me tell you, despite the rhetorical posture that might be taken. It is to extract a big return, okay? Which is, again, this is not a new thing. This has been the last 100 years of capitalism. The thing I think also missed a lot in the conversation is what is downstream of AI again. So there's one way of looking at it, which is the philosophical problems, the societal issues. There's also the literal inputs that go into AI. And so I think my fellow panelists touched on this, but this is really intimately tied to the energy conversation. So right now, to give you a very concrete and timely example, Taiwan, which is the single biggest manufacturer of chips in the world, is having trouble getting the inputs they need because of the Strait of Hormuz being closed. Okay, who has the money then to buy up the chips that are now getting priced up in the market? Well, it's like 5 people. Okay, so again, in the past, when you had things like browsers, or you had social media, or you even had like crypto tokens or whatever, it took a period of time to establish who were the critical players and the main actors. This has happened much faster. But part of that is the nature of the technology itself, how sticky it's proven to be very, very quickly with people. Like, most people are using AI day to day, or if they don't realize that they are in some cases, right? You're chatting with a bot, I mean, that's kind of what that is. Or you're actually going to these engines, these platforms, and you're making requests, or you're trying to use it to make your life, better in some form or fashion. So the uptake has been massive and at a scale that is unusual. That's also because we've been conditioned to just blithely give away our data, right, and not think much about that. And we have this conditioning that I think has led to that uptake being so fast as well. Okay, so now you're at a moment where it's the new FANG, or whatever your generational acronym is, for the top 5, let's say, companies that are controlling not just the market and the money, they're controlling the conversation. And this is what I think is extraordinarily dangerous. In the past, there was more skepticism, I think, there's some skepticism in policy, because I want to get to your question about policy, the second question you asked, what needs to be done in terms of policy. what needs to be in terms of policy, I think, is paying a lot of attention. Okay, so right now there's this bloomer doomer, they call it, kind of divide, or people who are like, no, we must let innovation flourish, and how could we possibly, we will lose out as a nation if we cede territory to the blah, 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 whatever it is, or some different argument, okay? Our company will lose shareholder value, whatever it is, something like that. On the other side of people who are like, no, AI is terrible, it must be stopped, at all costs, we have to just throw sand in the gears or just make it kind of like impossible to do. I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. And the more, I think, outrageous the rhetorical posture gets, the more the overturned window becomes like, it blows a whole, becomes the entire conversation. There's nothing you can't say at this moment in time in the world, but that's a problem, it's a different problem. But I think that at this point in time, there has to be a middle ground where you kind of say, look, the reality is there is an element. I'm not an inevitability doctrine person. I don't think anything is actually inevitable. I think we always can make choices. However, there is something to be said about the cat being a bit out of the bag here, okay? Pulling back at this moment in time is a bit of a silly thing, in my opinion. I'm not sure that's the right answer. On the other hand, the idea that innovators have always been net socially positive is ludicrous, as anybody can tell you, okay? And look no further than like generations of apology philanthropy, as I call it, like to prove the point, okay? So there has to be something in the middle, and I think the challenge has been, normally you'd have a lot of global bodies that were really tackling this. I'm so thrilled, that the military is taking, every time, it's always been taking very seriously, and for obvious reasons, but a lot of these bodies don't have the force and weight they used to have. So you're having to come up with new systems and structures to create a global conversation around this. And because this is now seen as a national, not only national pride, but there's this, look, I'll call it a sense, but it's probably true, that as we are in this multipolar world, that the country that has, or the group of countries that have the monopoly of sorts on AI are going to somehow emerge, victorious, and however you define victory in this context. So that has led to an erosion of information sharing, apart from in contexts where people who've built networks over generations are like, this is just too important, for example, the military. Pharma is another example. There's a lot of sharing that's happening very quietly, right? But for the most part, people are becoming very siloed about this and see it as a competitive posture, and that is impeding the ability to get strong policy across the line.
Sorry, there we go. I was just saying, we'll definitely add on to that, but before we continue down that, really, compelling thread, I wanted to ask Ling a quick question. So you mentioned that, you feel like you don't have a lot of expertise on AI specifically. You work on the science desk, right? But could you talk a little bit about, your vantage point on the conversations of, the kind of scientific arms race between the U.S. and China? I use that term, having read it in largely American publications. But how are you kind of making sense of the current state of collaboration or lack thereof between the U.S. and China on this, and how it might be affecting regulatory conversations?
I would say on Chinese social media, nationalism, those sentiments are certainly high. But from a more official point of view, China, allow me to say this, China is really willing to have more collaboration with the rest of the world, especially the U.S. In the past, when China had very little to contribute, the U.S. helped China, for instance, build its first particle collider back in the 1980s. And they also helped China build its radio telescopes and things. And also, allow me to say, in the space sector, China offered for foreign astronauts to get on board its space station. But there is this law called the Wolf Amendment here in the U.S. That forbids NASA to work directly with China. China was also willing to share its moon samples. But American researchers had to get Congress's approval to receive those samples. So yeah, from the official point of view, China definitely want more collaboration.
That's really good, really interesting to hear. But yeah, Asher, you wanted to jump into.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow because she made so many great points.
Yeah.
I think one of the issues that we're running into, and this is not new either to this area, but it's something we need to be aware of, is that the way policy works, the way any legislative protocol can occur, is through a very bureaucratic process. It's slow-moving intentionally because democratic oversight requires restraint. And that's because they're trying to reconcile competing interests, looking at how there's going to be downstream consequences, and also to prevent something hazardous from occurring before public harm actually transpires. And now Silicon Valley is directly at odds with that. How market works is directly at odds with that. So I wouldn't even specify this to AI. This is also how Wall Street works. And that is to be entirely speed-focused, scale-focused, because that's what's monetizable. And to evidence restraint is to actually be, started out, it was like, do no evil. I mean, that's not at all what their current mission statement is, you know, and that's across the board with most technology companies, including Sam Altman. Like, they all started out with this noble intention of wanting to serve humanity and like be beneficial. And aspects of the technology are, which is why they're sticky, which is why we use them. But it's also to our detriment because it is not built by the market forces that allow for us to be considerate, weighted, measured, sensitive, inclusive, any of the things that actually will be truly beneficial for humanity or sustainable and resilient in the long run. And that's why we run into these competing interests between what is actually going to be viable, needs to occur through this chain of command that has to be well considered, thought out beforehand, versus just who's first to market, who can push it out the fastest, who can scale the quickest, and that's just never going to reconcile.
So I do want to hear from Sophia and Sheila on this, but Asher, just to push on your perspective, I know that you're currently Chief Network Architect, right, at Shareholder Democracy Network. So you talked about how like these market forces are kind of fundamentally at odds with the kind of regulatory best interests, right? So how do you see like maybe reshaping market forces or how do you see it's changing the incentive structure, I guess, as like the role of that in getting this meaningful regulation across?
Yeah, and I think that is infusing the like notion of love and care back into every aspect of our expression. Economy didn't just come out of like nowhere, it came out of us, right? And so where is that humanity, the wholeness of what we are reflected in economy right now? It's like such a myopic take on what it means to be human. So therefore it ends up being extractive. It ends up being sort of our worst attributes at scale. And so I think when it comes to what we're trying to do with even shareholder democracy, like systemic transformation occurs when you reconcile the chasm. And one of the ways to do that is not to keep the nonprofit sector at odds with the for-profit sector, to not make money this soulless entity that just drifts, this fiction that drifts through the circulatory system of the world and corrupts everything it comes in contact with because it has no grounding. It has no anchoring in anything tangible. And one way to make it tangible is to assign a value system to it. And the way to do that is through civil society organizations being able to steward how money finds expression in the world. And so one way to do that is through shareholder governance and to allow for shareholders to vote through nonprofits and what they recommend as the guidelines through which we shape corporate governance, like who gets elected to the board, what a C-suite package should look like for compensation, pay equity, any aspect like workers' compensation and rights, all those things can be factored into when you're going through, including, like, I don't know how many of you followed Engine One with Exxon. So that was like a really compelling case where Engine One, this nonprofit, worked to like get 3 of the board members through shareholder proxy voting. By crossing the threshold, they managed to get 3 of the 9 board members of Exxon to be climate action driven. But then all Exxon did is, because they didn't reach the majority and didn't actually flip the board 5-4, they only got 3 of the 9 seats. Exxon just expanded its board and made it 11 seats, you know? So like what we need is aggregate, collaborative, outcomes. And for that, it can't just be Greenpeace or one nonprofit trying to win the day, or it's just Engine One. It needs to be like a coalition movement. So what we're looking for is that participatory impulse to come together, and we're forging it as an impact network instead of it being just one crusader who saves the day, because it's never going to be that. It has to be all of us, or it's going to be none of us. And so if you have multiple nonprofits bringing all of their voting power together, then they're able to meet the thresholds to actually flip the boards. And that's really the kind of insight they need to be having. A simple example of this is, like, we were trying to distribute, a nonprofit's voting recommendation to multiple fintech platforms, and they thought it was either or, because they're always used to constructing every campaign from scratch and going after an audience from scratch. So to do this notion of I've built a foundation and then I can build on that threshold year over year by campaigning and getting more people to vote in alignment with me through multiple platforms, that kind of like synergy, confluence, working with multiple people without being competitively at odds is not even in our vocabulary, and not even in the nonprofit sector's vocabulary, which is really interesting that we talk about collaboration and cooperation, but we don't actually do it, and we don't know how. So I think, yes, we can definitely make the markets, we can make anything we've given rise to have a sense of humanity infused in it. It's just a matter of being aware that it has to occur at a systemic level, which means we have to go back to the roots of how we've designed those initial chasms, like initial conflict points, right? Like, we have allowed for the divergence of nonprofit and for-profit, and instead of giving it a through line of saying it's part of the same system.
I think I love everything you just said. And I think, so I was one of the early lawyers who helped spark the impact investment category. Okay. And in California, we have something called a flexible purpose corporation. This is when B Corps were kind of still becoming a thing. It's called the H Corporation. The idea was you could have different outcomes. You could have a financial return, but you also had to have a social return. And so that was codified. You could make choices about the corporate structure that you had. The idea was that the trade-off that your shareholders understand is that you were going to take a slightly less financial return to get a measurable social return. So this spawned the field of impact metrics, which, if any of you are in Flensburg, you know kind of where that's landed, which is better than it was, but not as good as it could have been, like many things in life. And so I think that there was a whole notion for a good decade that was getting a lot of traction, especially in Europe, called stakeholder capitalism. And the idea was that consideration of just your shareholders and just the sort of owners of your stock, literally, and your board, that kind of governance, was not only not a complete picture, it was an irresponsible picture. And this was started at the World Economic Forum. It was kind of promulgated through Davos, and it had a lot of banks. Larry Fink was, in on this. Ray Dalio, interestingly, was in on this. A lot of these guys, especially in the banking sector, were very committed in their own ways. Just can read into that on moving this forward. And I can tell you that is largely dead. Okay, and so the conversations I have now are with some of these same people, not those two particularly, but others who are in that kind of mindset is, no, that was all a mistake, and what we need to do is go back to the world where our only responsibility, my responsibility as a CEO, is to my shareholders, that is giant, and look and see that the idealism that was either optically or maybe literally, who knows, present in someone's heart and mind when they were building something has converted into a completely different set of incentives and structures. And a lot of that isn't even. Certainly you could have people that choose to exit that. They appoint a CEO that's not them because they're uncomfortable. There's all kinds of ways you can manage that. But the reality is that if you take a company public, I have seen this happen to people that I know very, very well in my life. You watch a transformation because what you are beholden to by, in some cases, like the SEC, right, in the United States, and by law, is a very different set of constituents than what you were beholden to before. And the most obvious shift is from your users and your employees, like your team, to your shareholders, many of whom have no connection, are not trying to influence they don't care about what you're building, they just care about the market price of what you're building. So it happens gradually for some, it happens rapidly for some, but it is inherent in the system. And so I think if we don't call out the sort of angel to venture, this kind of pipeline of capital and the trade-offs that several people, I know some young people who started companies, and they don't get good advice. And next, their company is owned not by them in any fashion, right? It's owned by a set of stakeholders who have a very different set of incentives, and suddenly that all comes to call. So this is not in any way to provide apology or excuse, but it is to say there is a system-wide problem where incentives do change over time, and they change the more successful you are. The bigger you grow, the faster, the harder this hits you, and the sooner. And if you aren't bolstered against it, and you don't have a board where you have independence, right? You have independent board directors who are sitting in a different posture, who are creating accountability. If you haven't built into your governance some of these stakeholder capitalist kinds of ideas, which you can do it at time 0, but it's very hard to put in at time 1 being after you've either gone public or you're in the run up to that, right? So I just think that we place a lot of, and we should, don't get me wrong, accountability on individual actors, but they are also operating within systems. And this is something that I didn't realize till I was a CEO. Like I was like, when you're a CEO, you make all the decisions, everything is great. It's like, that's not really how it works, right? And it's a slap in the, it's kind of a punch in the gut, honestly, when you kind of realize that. And you're like, oh man, like I suddenly have all these there's this other level that I have to suddenly appease that I wasn't even paying attention to when I was 2 levels down in the company, right? So like I say, I put that out there to just say, I think that my hope is that the stakeholder capitalism principles, while they've gone underground and it's not something that's talked about kind of overtly or openly, they still exist. And you are seeing pushback from a lot of geographies. Europe and Canada leap to mind, but also countries in ASEAN, countries in sub-Saharan Africa, in some ways, weirdly, India, that are kind of trying to keep some of this awareness, in part because they realize that what we're heading for, if we don't take this seriously, is widespread social and political unrest, which we're already starting to see.
Yeah, thank you. Sophia, I feel like that kind of tees you up nicely, talking about, this being a systematic issue, this being an international issue, and you've also talked at length about, like, part of the challenge here being that this is not just a consumer technology, and it is also not just a military technology, it's inherently both. So what are your thoughts on what we've talked about thus far and the kind of unique challenges on the international scale?
Absolutely. So I think I'm enjoying myself so much because like all of the things that I've been working on are complemented so nicely by everything that's being said. So I'm really not, like, I'm just reminding myself of things that are so relevant. And going for something that Sheila, you said just in your first remarks, the narrative of an AI arms race is a narrative that is very useful for specific actors. But if we look into what AI is, again, as a massive category of technologies, it's not just one thing. In fact, in my work, I try to not use the term AI as much as possible because it's incredibly unproductive for policy to talk about AI. Because whenever you try to define it, it eludes definition. The most we can do is say it's a thing with an input that produces a certain output. That's that's as good as you can get. And so then we need to look at context and context of use and outcomes and intentions. But that's an aside, and I can ramble about that after the panel. But what is more relevant, if we look at kind of the geopolitical supposed arms race that we are in, is that the contributing components of artificial intelligence are incredibly internationalized. And so you cannot think of it as a nationalized technology. Not only are you looking at servers and data centers, and I still hope, Ling, that you're also going to talk about kind of public perceptions of all of these issues and how they've been discussed, but also the critical raw materials that are necessary to build the processors that enable the immense processing of data that happens at these data centers. There's also so for me, for example, being based in the Netherlands is actually a strategic choke point for the entire AI supply chain because of one company called ASML, which is the only company that makes the lithography machines, that's the printers of the processors. And they are the only ones that make those. And so if something happens in the Netherlands and they can't export those anymore, then everything kind of falls apart. And that's why we need to have these conversations internationally, globally, at global levels, because this issue, not only kind of like the consequences of AI becoming progressively more integrated into our everyday lives, those are spillover effects in, being multiplied to several degrees, but also the issue itself is inherently international. And we can't forget that whenever we hear, oh, well, we need to nationalize it, we need to privatize it, right? There's a reason why TSMC now has factories in Arizona, right? It's because the US is trying to bring that closer in, because also the area around Taiwan is geopolitically very difficult, complicated. But that should be motivating us to try to share more information. And that's also what the Global Commission that I was working with was attempting to do. But to kind of finish off the sandwich, at the highest level, we have states and kind of the global conversation that is happening. But we also have individual responsibility, I would say. Just like as people sitting in this room, we all have responsibility in relation to this issue. And it comes from, I really loved how you said it, paying a lot of attention. That's what every single one of us should be doing. The fact that you're in this very room is already such an amazing start. And thank you for being here. But like for me, an understanding of the dynamics that we're seeing around AI is inseparable from the kind of the capitalist context in which we exist and the incentives that are given to individuals to whether or not to use these technologies, right? It's about efficiency, it's about production, it's about kind of optimizing knowledge and making it that people can, well, you know, supposedly make better use of their time. But then what do we do with the time that we have left over? And I get it. Like, I don't hold any blame for people who, let's say, do what is called cognitive offloading. That means like using AI to do the difficult stuff because the world is so complicated. And here comes this thing where we're already in an age of, political turmoil, as you mentioned already as well. Like everything was kind of falling apart. And here's a perfect thing that can do the difficult thinking for you. And so I don't blame anyone. But there's so many, like once you become aware that there's incentives that are pushing you into a certain direction, you can take control and become an active participant instead of a passive user of generative AI, and be very conscientious about it and be conscious of what am I learning from this? What am I actually trying to get from this? Why do I want to use this tool? Is it because of supposed pressures, or is it because I really feel like it adds value to my life? And if we normalize this as individuals, then I also hope that there will be a trickle-up effect at some point where, you doing this actively, you bring this to your work, you talk to colleagues talk to more people, and we have this gradual mindset change about what this technology can do for us, and it becomes more of a tool for good, ultimately, I hope.
One thing I offer as a provocation to people regularly, especially my friends who are not, they don't consider themselves highly technical or technically fluent, is if everybody in the world used AI the way you use it and only the way you use it, what would we gain and what would we lose as a society, right? And I apply this to myself. I'm probably I'm not as often as I should. But I find it really powerful because I certainly use AI. I use AI every day. I use it for certain kinds of things. And as I kind of talk to people who are, educated, sophisticated people who are thinking about how to use it or not use it, there are consequences to these actions. And it's not to say any individual's use is going to suddenly determine the trajectory of how it's used, but it's an interesting question when it comes to responsibility of, what if that were the case? What if AI becomes, this is the AI my children get? And I love your point about defining AI, but for the sake of argument, right? What if this is what my children inherit? Right? Because these are tools. Okay, so I can tell you as somebody who was very early in the crypto blockchain space, it is not inevitable that turned into the casino of horror show that it is. Okay, that is not inevitable. And I was somebody who pulled very hard as I possibly could, against that, lost the tug of war, I would argue. But there's something about that core technology I still think is very valuable, and I have hope that will continue to emerge, right? There's no question about that. The same thing is true here. But the way we use it, we are training not just the models. In this case, we're literally training the models, but we're also training the builders on what we value and what's important to us. And that is a collective thing that we are doing every single day. So I think it's interesting to ask yourself, as I do, if this were the only way that people used AI, what would we gain and what would we lose? And the answers are often very upsetting, actually. So I put that out to
And
the
just
audience.
to add one point to what Sophia was saying about individual participation, just think about Quit GPT hashtag having trended in just this year, right? And that cost OpenAI $30 million in recurring revenue and $120 million in annual revenue. That's a real impact of consumers or the public saying no to their partnership with the Department of Defense, and in how ruthlessly he has gone about how he has scaled his company without any sort of checks and balances. So we really do have power in our hands as citizens, as stewards, to say no to a certain way in which technology is shaping our lives, and it has consequences as hard numbers on their bottom line for them. So never shirk that responsibility. Exercise your votes, exercise your values at every opportunity you can.
All right, so as we're going into kind of the final stretch here, I'd love to transition to some of the audience questions. We have a lot of really good ones. One that has cropped up a couple times, especially from students, is relating to the environmental sustainability aspect of AI and the sometimes outsized environmental impacts that it can have. And these questions are for you guys. I do want to chime in that, some people have mentioned it as the environmental cost as being kind of an inherent downside to AI, and I would push back against that. I mean, AI is inherently power consumptive, but the damage that causes is entirely dependent on, how those data centers are implemented, how, the corporation involved usually, or the government involved is like managing its effect on the people around it, the people around, the technology and the data centers and the infrastructure. But that does raise the question of like, how is the sustainability and the environmental impact coming up, if at all, in these regulatory conversations, whether private sector or international or, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I always tell anyone who's working on policy, if you want to know what's really going on, you have to look local. Okay, and so in 2024, there's a conference every year, it moves around. It's called the National Conference on State Legislators. And so it's where every state legislature sends, everybody basically from all 50 states and territories, and they come and they learn and all this stuff. And there's no better place in America to get a pulse on what people actually care about. Okay, I think unless you're interested in a very small geography, in which case a local board of supervisors or a mayor is going to give you like the best signal, okay? By the time you get to state level, you're already at a level of abstraction, and federal, forget it. That's more about who's going into the office and has that access. So in 2024, the number one most oversubscribed, I was on a panel, and it was like we went 45 minutes long, and the room was like standing room only, and it was one of 4 sessions on data centers. Okay, that was before, and I was telling people in Congress, this is coming for you, and they did not believe me. They were like, no one cares about that, blah, blah. And I'm like, everybody cares about it, okay? Because it hits NIMBY, YIMBY, it hits, allocation of resources, it hits land use, but it particularly hits renewables. Right, to your point. So that's why I touched on the energy conversation as being downstream of AI, but really critical. Because to your point, this is a highly consumptive, the current models are highly consumptive. As you move into smaller language models, others, there are ways to make this less energy consumptive that I think are really important and not getting enough airtime. But current state, very, very energy consumptive. The question is, what kind of energy? How is it generated? Who has access to it? Where are these things put? All of these questions are complicated, but what you're seeing is a very heightened level of awareness by individual citizens in their communities about how they feel about these being co-load, or how they feel about them existing in the first place, how they're using them in some cases, I think in very clever ways, to push for more renewable, like more investment in renewables, which is quite fascinating as well. So all of that, I think, is part of the conversation, and sometimes really gets lost. So I appreciate the question.
Okay, I just wanted to share my recent experience attending a AI data center hearing in Ohio. So we all know that these AI companies are pushing the fast expansion of AI infrastructures across the country. And if I remember correctly, Ohio is one of the top 5, the states that has the most AI data centers right now, probably more than 200. Of course, new ones are being planned. So this one that I attended happened in a town called Sunbury, which is very close to Columbus. And a few months ago, I remember it was a cold night. It was snowing, but a surprising number of people showed up. It was not even a special hearing just arranged for the planned AI data center there. It was a regular city committee meeting. So those residents just waited very patiently for the other items on the agenda to be finished. And then they went up to the podium. Everybody got to talk for 3 minutes. And they just shared very personal and practical concerns. Either like a grandparent being worried about what kind of environment the grandchildren would grow up in, or a young resident just worried about her electricity and water bills, or a construction worker who worked at some of these data centers and wanted people to know the potential safety risks involving these like huge room-sized diesel generators. or just a researcher who's worried about, how the light and noise pollution is going to affect wildlife. So for me as a journalist, it was a very precious experience because I got to see American democracy in action. And it got emotional at some point. I remember some people cried, some people joked. I remember a lady said, I would like to see one of these data centers built in Zuckerberg's backyard. Yeah. And I also noticed, although we read so much every day about how strategically important the AI is, and how there's this race going on between China and the US when it comes to AI, nobody actually went up to the podium and say, hey folks, it is important that we have these data centers because we need to beat China. Nobody said that. Yeah, they were asking a simple question: do we want this in our community? And I think the message is very clear and very strong. And it's very interesting to see how this plays out, especially at a time when AI companies are getting more powerful. I saw a headline yesterday that they are trying to get into the media business. OpenAI just bought a very popular tech talk show. So if they want, they can start to shape a narrative around AI more directly that way.
So two things I wanted to add to this. One is, so with Google, for instance, the whole conversation around shareholder advocacy began because they did want to change directions. They did approach us with a conversation of like, how can we be more like Patagonia? Because Patagonia is a benevolent dictatorship. One person decided, this is how I want my money to find expression in the world. But that's not a solution, especially as she said, as Sheila mentioned, that like once you go IPO, it's like you're acting after the horse has already left the gate. And now the only way to do that is by educating the shareholder, is by you exercising your vote. And you might think you're one in how many ever, and you may not even own enough shares, but you are a shareholder and your vote matters. And like Google building data centers, Amazon building data centers, you can exercise your vote. And if you do it through perhaps Greenpeace, your Sierra Club, it goes a greater distance, right? So there is aggregate power and there is value in us as citizens exercising our shareholder value. And then the other side of this, and Google wants that. Like people want to be like behaving better than they are, but again, they're pandering to market mechanics. So we can shift that narrative, that landscape. The other side of this is looking at why do we have data centers? Is this the only way for AI to find expression in the world? And it's not, okay? So the reason right now that we have so many data centers being built is because the kind of AI that we've started backing is basically just predictive modeling. And that's not the only way to be intelligent. In fact, it's the worst way to be intelligent. It's like you're just shooting darts in the dark and hoping it'll land in the right way. It's so ridiculous. And the only way you would do that is because you're complacent and just want to make quick money. It's a get-rich-quick scheme, essentially. And we're somehow just letting it go by. And the most effective way to create AI would actually be ontological. And I'm a huge evangelist of this because it gives you credible information. It allows you to have information provenance, to know where you're getting your AI responses from, how it's weighting that information. It gives you interpretive sensitivity. It gives you understanding. And like giving it ontology means something as simple as, if I were to give you the word affair into an LLM, it's predicting between, do I mean affair in a marriage context? Do I mean it in conference of world affairs? Do I mean it in relation to a government scandal? It's just shooting darts and hoping, okay, based on all the words you've said, this is what it's the closest to what you're asking about. And so if you can give it the context and give it the nuance and give it its relational purpose, its being, then it doesn't have to go through all of those permutations and figure out using all of that energy. It is so inefficient. Instead, if you've given it all of that context, all of that bearing, then it's sieving through a much more narrow channel, and it's telling you based on what is already known, which we have so much knowledge. It's just not being exercised or utilized intelligently. So of course, then it results in hallucinations where it's like, I think you mean affair because you're sitting on a chair, and it rhymed for me. It's as absurd as that, but that is a hallucination for you, right? So it's like, you have to think about the fact that we have so much data right now. We have such a great access to well-established, peer-reviewed, credible scientific information that can back pretty much any field that we want to get into. It's not a dearth of information that's causing these hallucinations. It's the way in which information is getting organized and churned back out to us. And so I do think we have an immense responsibility to advocate for a push towards ontological AI, towards AI that's actually going to give you clarity and insight into how it's pulling its responses out, why it's prioritizing the kind of information it is, and where it's drawing those information sources from. Give us the citations. I mean, these things were like implicit. Like, I couldn't even put out a book report in 4th grade back in the day without citation. And now we can just look for a prompt from AI and it gives you nothing. It's like, I just think your mother's doing this. I'm like, based on what, you know? And so I think asking why is critical. We are critical thinking beings. We should definitely be asking why. It's on us to hold these like beasts accountable because they've been built by very simple-minded people who are just after money and don't want to apply themselves properly.
That's very well put, Asher. So we had another few questions also kind of touching on this idea of like the Cold War analogy and the arms race analogy that people make about AI. So I'll direct this towards you, Sophia, but anybody should feel free to chime in. How do you feel about the Cold War analogies here? How does that, like the nuclear disarmament conversations that we've had in the past, inform this conversation? In which ways does it not apply? What are your thoughts on the utility of that?
Again, I like to give simple answers when I can. I think it's very harmful. I think it's not useful to make the comparison for many different reasons. The first one, and this is something that I directly experience in my work, AI is not a weapon. It is a component that can be put into different weapon systems, and it becomes a subcomponent of a system. It's the same as internet or GPS. An analogy that I enjoy a lot more is actually electricity. Electricity is an enabler of many different things that needs to be integrated into systems of systems. AI is a similar thing when you're looking at different types of AI as well, not just generative AI. So I think it is an unproductive analogy because then we, come into the thing that I already mentioned where policy and solution conversations become incredibly unproductive because we don't actually pinpoint what AI is in these conversations. But at the same time, we can't apply any of the lessons learned. Well, no, we can apply some lessons learned, but kind of like the concrete measures that emerged during during the Cold War and also prior with other technologies, they feel like they don't apply in the same ways. And so there's even arguments that people make that like, oh, well, like conventions on certain conventional weapons, when we introduce AI into conventional weapon systems, well, we need to come up with new regulation. I don't think that is the case. But what we do need to think about is, well, for example, how do we verify AI? This requires new ways of verification. Because, well, let's say when you have a targeting, let's say we have like an aerial missile defense system that has AI-enabled targeting. From an exterior point of view, you're not going to be able to tell that that system is using AI. And so our usual methods of verification that, for example, use satellite, that use component tracing, they don't work anymore because things are a lot more subtle, they're integrated, and it is part of an entire system. And at the same time, I think it, like this is kind of on the practical side, the first few things that I said, but on the other hand, it also puts us into this escalatory mindset. And this relates to something that you said just now. And it's like one of my favorite examples to bring up during, like I give a lot of like lectures at universities. And when I say this, people are like, whoa, really? I'm like, yeah, really. Generative AI has a war bias because of the way that we think about war. You are not going to ask, should I not go to war? No, you're going to ask, should I go to war? And because of the way that current generative AI models work, they're going to interpret the affirmative should as being associated with war. So they're going to give you a lot more reason, like, you know, I've tried this out. They're going to give you the reasons yes first, and then they'll say, well, maybe you should consider not doing this later. But first, because of the way we think about things, that impacts the way that we interact with this tool. And if we exist in this context where we see it as another arms race that is unproductive, but still we feel this existential dread, then of course the way that we interact with the models is also going to feed into that only further. And what makes it so complicated as well from like, outside, I don't know if they're still there, but I have some of my reports on confidence building measures. And what makes confidence building measures around AI so difficult is because right now it is both what I call both the subject and the object of competition. It is both the thing that we are competing over, but it's also what we're using to signal about our competition with each other, which makes it very difficult to disentangle the thing that we want from the thing that we're already using to prove that we are better somehow. And that is also how it is different from any of the other like weapons that we could look at, especially during the Cold War, and like nuclear is, for example, a concrete thing. We could identify that very concretely, like, do you have it or not? Here, we don't know, and it's already so internationalized, we can't apply those same principles. And so then we need to think about it in new ways, but not discredit the things that we already have. For example, the frameworks of international law, and how we can do this, and this is my last point, I promise, is by thinking about outcomes. What do we want the end state to look like, regardless of the technology that we are using and regardless of the tools that we have at our disposal, right? And that kind of solves the what is called like the AI power paradox, like between regulation and the rate of innovation, is if you think about, well, you know, we have an ideal state where hopefully we want humanity to still be alive. And if we're working towards that, it doesn't matter what kind of AI emerges later. Do we get general artificial intelligence, whatever that is? That doesn't matter, because we'll know what how our values connect to the outcomes that we find most desirable. And there's still space for values to change, but it is a lot more of a productive way to think about things.
Yeah, before we, absolutely. Before we move into wrapping things up, but just to stay on that track. So Sheila, I'm curious, do you have thoughts on the question of like, how do we verify what the AI is doing? What are the challenges in that? What are some potential solutions that would help with the kind of enforceability component?
It's currently actually not that hard to do. There's just not a lot of incentive for anyone to do it, right? So this is, as usual, it's a coordination problem. And some of the coordination is that we don't have a standardized way of talking about attestation or verification within AI. For some things we do, the black box problem that someone alluded to earlier, we do have a way of kind of defining what inputs went in and et cetera, but that's like less interesting, actually. I think what's more interesting is this, well, obviously I think it's more interesting, I'm working on it, but what's more interesting, I think, is this, this attestation of when and how a human is engaging with these systems, right? So is there audit of the inputs that are going in? Is there audit of the prompt? Is there all of that, right? And the reason I think that's so important is because you can't create accountability without identification. And that identification needs to be standardized to make it efficient and to make it possible for people to kind of compare, you know, apples to, I don't know, apples-ish, okay, like AI apples, which are not quite apples, right, but sort of apples. So I think that's really important work, but it is all possible. The other thing I think is that people are there's a lot of like conversation around transparency in AI systems, but one thing I can tell you from reporting from the crypto world is transparency does not necessarily lead to accountability. Just because you can see something doesn't mean you know what to do about it, right? And so I love mechanisms like shareholder accountability and governance, strike litigation, all these things are really important, but they sometimes, especially in litigation context, are quite downstream from the harm. Right? Like there's a lot of time that has to go by for you to figure out that there was harm and then how to assess where the harm was and to create a coalition around that. I have a lot of people who work in impact litigation in my world. I'm a lawyer, and so getting a class action together, all of this takes a lot of time. And meanwhile, the harm is continuing to happen, right, in many cases. So these are ways of basically doing quick standardized verifications about where and how humans are engaging with these systems, at what stage. And I think eventually there will probably emerge, maybe not from us, some sort of rating system that says, in this context, this is a better way of doing it than this other way. In this other context, maybe it doesn't matter. Or maybe it's actually flipped, right? Depends on what you're trying to do. So again, context is very important. But yeah, all of this, you can do all of this now. It's just without a mechanism for creating accountability. What does that mean? How do we pause? Is there regulation that has to come into effect? All of that. I think it's difficult to know what to do with the information, even if you have it at this moment.
Thank you so much. So last few minutes here, I wish that we could go longer because there's so much to talk about, but maybe we'll just from everybody, just a few sentences on, in the interest of ending on an optimistic note, what you think like a realistic goal or hope is in the regulatory space, however you choose to interpret that, whether that's like a practical or a legal achievement, and maybe we can start at the end with Ling.
Well, again, I know very little about, AI regulation, but I just want to share like a conversation I had with one of my editors lately. I said, we are encouraged to use AI in newsrooms, and as we use it more and more, am I going to lose my job? But the editor said, no, don't worry about that. When there's an issue or problem with your article, we need a human being to be blamed. So you will be there to take the blame. We cannot blame ChatGPT or Gemini, so don't worry. So yeah, if they pay me, I'm okay to take the blame.
So I think a couple of things. One is that in terms of energy efficiency, yes, let's not go through the recourse of putting everything to the wall and hoping something is going to stick and that's going to be our recourse. That's predictive modeling. I think being intentional about context, purpose, and being for every bit of information that is put in is immensely helpful. And then also, I would personally, from an environmental and sustainability perspective, just because we're not there yet and this is where we are, per query, I would love to see the footprint of my ask, just to know, hey, you did this. It's like having cigarettes with the skull on the side. It's just for my own awareness and said in terms that I actually will understand, not just that this used whatever gigabytes, but here's, you used up as much energy as 4 houses, right? To ask this really stupid question about something, right? Which you could have just created, but it's not even an option anymore. I can't go to Google and do an SEO search because even that defaults to Gemini. So everything is defaulting to AI now, so you don't have the option of asking a non-high energy consumptive question. So something to think about. So I think everybody should be asked to put the footprint, carbon footprint, and water footprint of every single query, because that educates us on how we should be using this technology and also educate, and hold accountable to some extent the people putting this technology out there. And then the other side of it is, I think, when we are doing any kind of content put out there, we have to be mindful that so many voices currently are going unheard and unrepresented, and that inequity in society is getting scaled exponentially through current AI. And so we have to realize that so much of indigenous wisdom is getting further eclipsed. It's not in the query results. So much of anything that is outside of the norm of easy to pull out text, and also it's not behind a paywall. So people whose information it's pulling from, they're not getting compensated for it. Once again, building the right firewalls for that to ensure information is there is gatekeeping to protect the people who are actually doing the research, putting this material out there, especially in an era where all of the funding source that should have come from government is running out or being unplugged. I think there has to be greater responsibility and stewardship in how information is made accessible and who can pull that information out from where. And I think a lot of scientists and researchers are suffering right now. A lot of communities are suffering right now, and it's not really being talked about in all of the conversation about AI. We talk so much about data centers, but we're not talking about the inequity that is being scaled exponentially.
All right, well, I think we have to call it there. I'm so sorry, but let's get a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you so much for coming. I knew I learned a lot, and I hope everybody has an awesome rest of your day.